Welcome to Great Loop Radio, brought to you by America's Great Loop Cruisers Association. We're dedicated to sharing Great Loop information and inspiration with those actively cruising, planning for, or dreaming about a Great Loop adventure. I'm Kim Russo. I'm the director of AGLCA. Today we're going to talk about doing the loop by bringing crew aboard. And this might pertain to people who perhaps have a significant other or spouse who does not want to do the whole trip, or somebody who's planning to do it solo but would rather have the company and the help for some of the parts of the trip. So our guests will be Chris and Hube Hopkins. They recently completed the loop using this method, and they're going to tell you about how they managed it, because I think the biggest question for a lot of people is logistics on something like that, where you're bringing on lots of different crew members, and I'll let them tell you all about that. Before we jump in with Chris and Hube, I do want to take a moment to recognize and thank our Admiral sponsors who support AGLCA at the highest level. They are Curtis Stokes and Associates, Passage Maker Trawler Fest, Skipper Bob Publications, and Waterway Guide Media. As always, we encourage our listeners and viewers to support these businesses that support the Great Loop. So an official welcome now to Hube and Chris Hopkins. Thank you for joining me. Welcome to Great Loop Radio.
Yeah, what a pleasure. I've listened to so many of these podcasts. It's fun to be on one.
Yeah, well, and first of all, a big congratulations to you. You completed the loop 10 days ago, November 19th, aboard your Grand Banks 42. And I know, Chris, you did parts of it with Hube, and Hube, you also brought 11 other crew members aboard for different pieces. So that's what we really want to talk about today. But let's just start off kind of from the beginning, Hube. What interested you in doing the Great Loop?
Well, I was one of the I guess early people who I've been wanting to do the loop for probably over 35 years. I bought my first little small Grand Banks back in 1985, and the loop was just a kind of a general idea in those days. Your parents really kind of, pioneered this whole thing. And so I got the bug way back then and been following the loop. And, finally, with some of your great work, there's so much resources on AGLCA that I joined, and and finally bought the boat, and then finally actually ended up doing it. I wasn't sure any of those things were ever going to happen, but they did.
Mm-hmm. And Chris, I understand that you were reluctant, maybe not reluctant about, the idea of the loop, but reluctant to do the entire trip with Hube. So tell us about that. What made you decide that perhaps doing the entire 6,000 or so miles was not for you?
Well, first of all, I'm not a real avid boater. I never have been. So I was brought up in a northern state where boating wasn't done much. I mean, my whole family didn't particularly, we didn't know boating. Let's put it that way. I first was introduced to boating by Hube after I married him. So I was never comfortable, and still am not, various different aspects. So the thought of doing a whole trip like that by boat, 6,000 miles, was just not, I don't know, it was just not something I knew I would be able to do, the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's part of, I think, what makes your story interesting, because for some couples, that would be the impasse right there. One person really wants to do it, one person not so much. So, we encourage everybody to do the loop in a way that works for them, in a way that is pleasurable to them. It is pleasure boating. So you reached this, what for many would be an impasse, as I said, but for you was not. But did you consider different possibilities for how you would do this? Hugh, did you ever consider not going? Chris, did you ever consider perhaps you would do the whole thing? And how'd you end up to, where Chris was along for the ride when she wanted to?
Well, you want to answer first? Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I never considered wanting to do the whole thing, but I knew that it was a passion and a long-term goal of his. So I wanted to try to support him in the best way possible. So we kind of hashed it out a couple of times as to how it might work. It was still very frightening to me, not knowing how long he was going to be gone for, certain segments or whatever, how much it was going to cost. That was another factor I was concerned about. But as the planning went on and we talked about it, it kind of seemed to fall into place. So I'll let Hugh expand on that.
Yeah, and it sort of evolved, I guess, over the years. My son, who ended up doing a fairly sizable part of the loop with us, Brian, he's an avid boater. And so that was, he was my backup, if you will. So the one thing that happened that made it really possible this year was he graduated law school, took the bar exam, actually passed it, but he had 6 weeks or 7 weeks in there between bar exam and starting work. So he was able to do the whole Northern Canadian part of it, and the timing of it worked so he could meet us up in Brewerton, New York, and do all the really fun part in Canada, Great Lakes, and he went all the way to Grafton, Illinois with me. So I think that's an important point, that there probably needs to be one person in all of this who's kind of an anchor, who can do multiple legs with you or do one long leg. It would have been a lot harder without him there, because that would have added from 11 legs or so, 10 legs to 15 legs. And it was already starting to wear on me by the time we finished. So I would say that was an important part of it. I will also say that doing nothing is always an option, right? So anytime you got a decision, doing nothing should be an option. But that we pretty much worked through that.
So, and I had the pleasure of meeting Brian, and well, I saw all three of you, but meeting Brian for the first time in, I think it was Sturgeon Bay, that our paths crossed. And that was certainly a lot of fun. So he was kind of the anchor. How many legs, Chris, did you wind up doing?
I did, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 total. And I think we ended up with 14. A lot of them were down the middle of the country. I kind of knew off the top of my head, right up front, that I did not want to do the rivers down the middle of the country. I think I had read about that, how it wasn't very pretty. It could be kind of frustrating at times, and you had to kind of compete with the barges and the tugs and all of that. So that, for some reason, didn't interest me. I wanted to do as many pretty parts as possible. And I also wanted to do some cruising with my brother, who was really excited about this whole thing. So wanted to capitalize on the time that we could spend time together. So
which legs did you choose as the ones that you wanted to be part of?
Well, I wanted to be starting right at the beginning. So we did the Stewart Charleston leg, and then went to Brian's graduation in Washington, and then did the Bayboro, North Carolina to Oxford, Maryland segment with my brother. And then did the Erie Canal, Hudson River, New York Harbor segment with my brother again. I knew I wanted to do the Trent Severn Waterway right off the top. I had heard so many good things about it. So, and we're all going to be together as a family for 2 weeks. So that to me was the highlight of any of the segments. And then Door County. And I was supposed to do the last leg in Florida from Tampa back to Stewart, so I could be at the end of it too, but Hurricane Ian put a damper on all of that. So
right, as it did many things.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you definitely hit a lot of the highlights, and you know, from the look on your face, I think you also had a wonderful experience with the parts that you did.
Absolutely. I mean, there were some parts of the Erie Canal that we were very disillusioned with, but it was the Erie Canal. I mean, to say that we were on the Erie Canal is just,
yeah, pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
So it sounds like between, you know, Brian and Chris and Chris's brother, you had several anchors there of the crew, so to speak.
Right.
So how many other crew members did you bring aboard, or how many were there total?
There would have been 8 other people. And so, you know, all would stay usually about a week. 5 days was the shortest. The longest was about 3 weeks, but that was the last leg where I had to add a person. I had a guy who was very experienced. He was going to go across the crossing with me. And I ended up asking him to stay going through Fort Myers and all that, because we did a lot of that offshore. So he stayed with me for that whole part, kind of unexpectedly, when I didn't feel comfortable asking Chris to come along when it was going to be all anchoring, and I wasn't sure what we were going to find down there. So,
right. Yeah. So, you know, obviously, Hube, you've been boating for a long time. You have a lot of boating experience. What was it that made you feel the need for crew? You know, was it the technical aspect of you know, having a second person on watch, so to speak? Was it the social aspect? You know, tell us more about the reason for choosing to bring crew aboard.
Well, I think there were, I really admire these people who do it solo. I ran into several on the loop, but I think it's a little nutty, to be honest. I love those couple of guys that I did meet, but I think it's not very safe. I've been boating a long time. I got over 50 years of experience. And, as far as me going from one short little period, one place to another place by myself, probably not a big deal. I do it sometimes in the Chesapeake Bay and other things, but, I mean, things can go wrong. You can fall. There can be something wrong with the boat or some navigational emergency. Just having somebody there to hold the wheel for 5 minutes is pretty much a necessity. I mean, I know people do it because nothing's gone wrong and nobody's killed themselves doing it, but I just think it's unsafe.
Right. And that's fair enough. As I said, to each their own on how they choose to do the loop.
Yep.
And I think there are many people who do it solo who, if they had a little bit of a bigger boat, a lot of solo loopers choose a small boat specifically because they know they'll be solo.
Right.
But for loopers on a boat your size, again, we're on a Grand Banks 42. I think there probably are many who would love to have crew aboard, but aren't quite sure how to find those people or how to organize those people. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So how, obviously a few of them were family members. How did you find your 11 crew members?
Well, it's interesting when you asked me that. I when I went and looked at all of them, they had all cruised with me before, with two exceptions. One was a friend who I brought along, or now a friend who I brought along, who was the nephew of a friend of mine who passed away this past year. And I knew he was like really interested in buying a boat, living aboard, and eventually doing the loop. And, it just felt like a way to give back to him. So I brought him along. He had a great time, and he's a lot closer to your age than mine, but we had just the best time, and bonded. And then I got hooked up with Ken Pfeiffer, who's a harbor host in Grafton, Illinois. And he came along with me for a little while for one segment as well. So everybody else, though, I had already cruised with before, because, I'm delivering the boat up and down, but I'm bringing the boat up and down the East Coast 6 or 7 years before this. And a lot of times Chris didn't want to go. And so I would have, and these people had come along before, so basically they were people that were interested in boating, friends of mine, and they would either do it combination of things. I think they were interested for the boating aspect. They loved to be on a boat. They also did it, sort of as a favor to me, knowing that if they didn't come along, I might have to do it by myself. They didn't want me to go kill myself. But I think they just did it because, I asked them to come along, and they knew I wanted them to come. So they said, sure. And then
It's like a vacation.
the other thing that I think we hit on it earlier is I tried to make it as easy as possible. So the logistics coming in and out, flights, marinas that we were at, all those things, I tried to make that as simple and as reasonably inexpensive for them as I could.
Yeah. Now, did you have the Grand Banks 42 before you started the loop?
Yeah, I've had that for going on 7 years now.
Okay, because I think
so
one thing
with the boat,
one thing I hear from people is that, when they tell their friends and family they're buying a boat of a typical looper size, everybody wants to come along, everybody wants to ride on the boat. And then when it comes down to, getting into the details of when can you come, well, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people don't have the lifestyle that allows them to have the flexibility to do this kind of travel, where you can't necessarily, and it's kind of an old looper adage that you can tell guests when you'll pick them up or where you will pick them up, but you can't tell them both. And a lot of people, I think, struggle with that level of flexibility. So how did you manage that? I know you kind of were choosy about, it sounds like you did a lot of pre-planning about where the stops would be and where the crew would exchange. So tell us a little bit about how you chose those places and how far in advance you were able to plan that.
Yeah, I started with the Looper's Companion book and the big map, and that really became my schedule. I started with the people who were my favorites first, of course, Chris and her brother and Brian, and I knew where they were going to fit on my map. And then I started adding my favorites first. So the people that had been with me before, my closest friends, I started filling those in to what their schedule was around holidays and other events they had. And so I'd pick out segments that I thought they would enjoy. And, they got kind of first dibs on what legs we were going to do. The legs were sort of defined, though, by where there was a really good airport, where you have transportation, which was a bigger problem than I thought it was in a lot of cases. There's no Ubers around and no taxis and those things. Then Enterprise, was a big snafu in Half Moon Bay one time, another story. And then also where we could replenish. So you had to have those four things to do a crew change, I felt like. So we ended up, transportation got solved with Ubers and taxis, and in most places we could find, if we really dug deep enough, we could find somebody, a private driver, to go pick up somebody at the airport. We did that for Chris in Green Bay going to Door County. We also did it, the biggest logistical nightmare was down in Grand Harbor, Kentucky, where I had to take people in and out of Nashville. It's 2.5 hours away. So we used a driver for one part of that, and then I had a rental car for the other part of it. So, we stopped in places. I can reel off a list if that's okay, where we stopped.
Yeah, I think that would actually be helpful for people who maybe are contemplating the same thing. Would be good to know where those crew exchanges happened, because you've done the legwork for them to figure out where that combination of good airport and other ground transportation exists.
Yeah, I don't think these are the only ones, but Stuart, Florida, Charleston, Oriental, North Carolina, that was a little stretch, but I have family there, and so Oriental is a natural place for me. I had plenty of drivers there. Oxford, Maryland, Half Moon Bay, New York, which is a common one, Brewerton, New York, and both of those marinas are great places. I mean, the marinas are both spectacular looper supporters. Midlands, Ontario was another one when we finished the Great Loop. So that was easy enough. It was about an 1.5 to 2-hour trip to Toronto for Chris. So we were able to do that. Sturgeon Bay, and then she flew out of Green Bay. Grafton, Illinois is a great place. You had Ken there to help with transportation, and St. Louis is close by. Paducah, Kentucky, Grand Harbor down in Kentucky, and then Mobile. So,
yeah. And
list,
I
right?
mean, that is very helpful, because a lot of people don't, until you pull out a map and until you look at these options, people don't know how close Brewerton, New York, for example, is to the Syracuse airport. All these little hidden gems that are actually feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, but they're actually fairly close to a decent airport and some good transportation.
Yeah, there were places, and there probably is a lot more, but places like Brewerton Marina there, I forget the name of the marina, but it's in Brewerton, New York. You can't miss it.
We've got 2 AGLCA sponsors there. One is SK Yards and the other is Winter Haven.
Yeah, Winter Haven. So,
yep.
yeah.
They're fabulous there.
They didn't charge us enough for leaving. We left the boat there for 10 days.
Yeah. So let's take a quick break and play a message from one of our sponsors. When we come back, I just want to talk a little bit more about, what the expectations were of the crew, any special skills that they needed, and any special skills you felt you needed when you were taking on crew that you knew and had cruised with, but it's not the same as doing all 5,000 miles with the same person. So we'll talk about some of those skills when we come back.
Okay.
This is a message from Steve, the dockmaster at Half Moon Bay Marina. If you're heading up the Hudson River, Half Moon Bay is 20 miles north of the George Washington Bridge. They have stellar dog walking paths and parks that start at the marina. They're the only deepwater marina in a 30-mile radius, and the marina is fully protected with a wave-attenuated seawall. Half Moon Bay has many services, including high-speed Wi-Fi, pump out, divers, mechanics, and access to enterprise car rental with free pickup and delivery. Half Moon Bay is very close to a local airport and train service to New York City, and they offer looper discounts at a local fuel dock. Stop by and see them when you're on the Hudson River.
We're back on Great Loop Radio. Today we are talking with Chris and Hube Hopkins. They completed the Great Loop on November 19th, which is just 10 days ago from when we're recording this. So congratulations to both of you. Their style of looping, Chris went along for the parts that she felt she would enjoy. Hube did the entire thing with a combination of 11 different crew members throughout the course of the loop. So a great option for people who have others who are willing to come, or even maybe able to find some folks along the way who might be able to provide that second pair of hands and second set of eyes, so to speak. Hube, we were talking a little bit about where you exchanged crew and how you, reached out to friends to help you with this. Did you have the entire route kind of mapped out with all of the stops and the crew members before you even left?
No, not the whole thing. I'd say I did it in halves. I had the whole first half until my son Brian got off. That was all planned out when I left Charleston. So all of those stops, and I mean, not the day-by-day stops, but the crew
Right.
changing ones, those were all pretty much set when I left. So that took me from March, and then I messed around some in Charleston with the boat, and then the boatyard in Oxford. But yeah, that whole schedule from March up through time we left Chicago, actually, which was determined by the lock in Juliet. Right? September 4th was, I think, as I recall. I'll probably never forget that day.
So
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, yes. So go ahead.
So, how far in advance, because most of these people were flying in to act as crew for you, how far in advance were you doing things like booking plane tickets?
Well, usually at least a month, but the airlines have gotten more flexible about that. So that turned out to be not as big a deal because just because of the nature of airlines changing because of COVID and all. I will say, though, we were extremely lucky. We never had a snafu where somebody had to rebook tickets or, sleep in a hotel or any of that.
The guy from Canada got COVID. Your colleague from Canada.
Well, that was early on, though. I did have a work colleague who was going to come in, and he got COVID, but that was fairly early on. I think before I even left, or before I had seriously left the Chesapeake Bay, which is where I really started running fast to go do it. So yeah, that turned out not to be much of an issue, and partly airlines and partly just good luck. I think good planning.
Yeah, well, and you said that you had done the planning, you had the legs or the crew change spots picked out. We all know that another kind of looper adage is the most dangerous thing to have on a boat is a schedule. And if you have not heard that before, for anyone listening, sometimes having that schedule leads to poor decisions about traveling on a weather day when it would have been safer to stay at the dock, those types of things. Hube, obviously you have a lot of experience, so probably didn't let something like that influence you. But because you had a schedule for the most part all the way around the loop, how did that impact your overall experience? Did you feel like you were kind of running fast in some circumstances to try to reach where you needed to be?
Well, I did occasionally, of course. Yeah. I do believe the adage is absolutely correct, and people ought to think about that and take that to heart. And I tell that to all my crew members. They know the same adage. They know that this is risky, that something could happen, the boat could break down, it could be weather, whatever. So they know that ahead of time, and I clearly forewarn them of that. But that being said, I think it is true that you can do this. There's some key points, I think. You really got to be flexible inside those little windows. So I always built in, Brian and I always figured one weather day for every 5 underway days. Now I'm pretty aggressive about running in bad weather because, the boat's a good solid boat. You got a down below salon that I use more than I use the fly bridge. I'm pretty experienced in bad weather. I don't mind running in the fog. I don't particularly like the night. We may talk about that some, but not that you had to do much fog on the loop. I think maybe one day. But I think you do have to build in flexibility inside the segment. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to make all these 70-mile days every day. That's just not going to happen because things are going to go wrong. And then you need to be able to predict the weather ahead of time. So, I've gotten pretty good about using the tools that Eddie uses on his weather wag and those things to predict the weather and be able to look out ahead 4 or 5 days a week, 10 days, and say, wow, we better get moving here. Now, related to all that was I didn't really feel like I had to see everything on the loop. Pretty much made up my mind early on. Hey, if there's something up here I really want to see, like Clayton, New York might be a perfect example. We love that. I didn't get enough time in the Thousand Islands. I would drive back to see that in a second, so sometime when I'm up there, I'd love to drive back. But I figured any of those things, even Canada, I could see again if I really wanted to. So I didn't let that worry my brain that I was going to miss some sightseeing thing. And it did, when you had weather coming, that made for long days. You might have to do 100, 120 miles in a day, start before daylight and end, at sunset, that sort of thing. I think it does lead to a couple of special skills. I'd say the three biggest skills, I wrote them down somewhere here, were probably being able to anchor anywhere you needed to. So that gave me the confidence, if you will, to go anywhere. I could be late getting to a marina, which didn't happen very often, maybe once or twice. But I always had confidence if push came to shove, I could pull off the side of the river between two of these wing dams on the Mississippi River and set a stern anchor and sit there for the night if I needed to, and which we did once or twice. So anchoring is a very important skill if you're going to do this, I think. It's an important skill anyway. I know some people don't like to anchor so much. I think the other skills are being able to run in the fog or at night. I don't mind the fog so much. I really don't like the night. It probably goes back to my Navy experience. The night's just really confusing. There's a lot of idiots out at night that you don't find out in the fog. The idiots usually stay home when it's fog, and you just have the weather to deal with. So I would say those skills, pretty much the big things to have, which I think most of the loopers have that capability.
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, I'm with you on the dark for sure. We did have a couple of mornings on the rivers though, where we knew we had a long day and we did leave before first light. And that was not nearly as disconcerting as I expected it to be. And we only did that if we knew, the marina we were at was within a mile or two of a lock. So we knew, we'd likely wait at the lock. We'd have the 30 minutes or so actually locking through. And by the time we were coming out of the lock, the sun was up and, we had gained an hour in our daylight. Well, in our cruising day, because of that short little period of darkness, it was just not nearly as scary as I
Exactly.
expected.
So it's a lot easier to do in the morning when you're leaving because you've already seen where you were. You know what this looks like. Doing it at night when you're coming into somewhere, very shaky. We did it one night. I can't remember the marina. You might remember, it was out of one of the locks. The lock kept us there till 10 o'clock at night. Marina stayed up and there was this whole army of people there to get us in, but it was this impossible little place to get in.
It was probably
Parallel,
Heritage Harbor.
probably
The marina.
To the river, and they're out there shining a light trying to bring us in. It was dangerous as heck, and one boat almost did run aground. When I left the next morning, I said, my God, how did we do that? There was like 8 of us and we managed to do it, but it wasn't the safest thing as far as running aground. I don't think we were going to hurt ourselves, but we could have easily run aground.
Yes. And we had a similar experience. There were 2, I think, legs where we're held up by locks and got there later than we had planned, leaving in the morning, knowing that's a possibility when you're going through several locks. Right. Never had one in pitch black, but had some after dusk and was getting dark. And it is just so much easier to leave early while it's still dark. Exactly as you said, you've seen the place in daylight, so you kind of have your bearings a little bit more. But so yeah, those skill sets, being comfortable with that is super important to do the loop anyway. All 3 of them: the anchoring, the being comfortable on a dark morning, and the weather predictions. Right. But especially helpful when you've got that schedule. And for a completely different reason, we've had a bit of a schedule too, because we both work aboard and have places that we are committed to being in. A lot of your experiences are very similar because Michael flies out a lot for work. So that's why I know that, Brewerton, New York's right by the Syracuse airport. You can be there in 10 minutes. Exactly. But it's the same kind of experience, and it's a different requirement. I still don't like to say that we're on a schedule. We just have kind of benchmarks in mind of where we'd like to be. And, we have been committed the whole time to, if we could not get the boat to where we needed to be, then we'd park it and take a car. And that has always, we've been fortunate as well that we've been able to get the boat there. But as long as you have that plan B, the schedule thing doesn't have to be a horrible, bad word. It can be okay, as long as you don't let that force you into some bad decisions. But besides go ahead, Hube.
I was going to say, there's one thing I forgot to say back when we were discussing the schedule thing, and that is you do always have to keep safety number one in mind. I mean, I was captain of a ship in the Navy, and safety was always the number one thing, that nobody gets hurt. We don't do anything that's going to hurt anybody. We may run the boat aground and damage a prop or something, but so you really always got to keep that safety in mind first thing, and not ever push it. I don't want to in any way imply that we push safety to go make a schedule or something, because that's just not the way it was.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, your level of competence and confidence in your boat handling and in managing the boat itself is part of what makes that difference. And we were well into the loop, and Michael of course has done the whole loop twice, but before we had our first dark morning underway, we were well into the loop. I think if we were trying to do that right out of the gate, I probably would have been extremely nervous. So absolutely agree with the safety first. And with that in mind, how did you go about kind of training up each individual crew member quickly as they came aboard? I know you said you had cruised with many of them, so many of them had some boating experience, but how did you kind of, instruct them on how to do things on your particular boat in these circumstances?
Well, for somebody that's absolutely due, I have a checklist. I love checklists. I got probably 20, 30 of them. I've stolen some from the Great Loop website, but I have a checklist for somebody who's brand new, and I'll actually go through that and show them everything over a period of the first day. For people that have been with me before, I mean, or they have some experience, there's only a couple of things. I want them to make sure they know how to use the head and make sure that they know how to throw a line. And that's about all I need, like to get underway. When I tie up the boat, when I come into a marina, I always, I just make it as easy as possible on everybody. We have marriage savers. I go out and I personally rig the lines, 3 lines on each side, 2 fenders on each side. I'm ready to go alongside port or starboard. I don't have to go figure that all out at the last minute. And so all they have to do is get one line that I tell them to get this line to that person on the dock, or, we'll get it looped around a cleat or something. Then they don't really have to know too much. So I try to make it as simple as possible. And then, as far as teaching them to pilot the boat when we're underway, I do it a little at a time, right? Start with a little manual steering, and then, teach them all about how to use the autopilot and some of the risks of that, and the anomalies of my particular boat, which there are a couple. And then we just gradually work through it. And what I do is I take every opportunity to train them that I can. So when an opportunity presents itself, I try to explain it without being too overbearing. I can be a little bit overwhelming to people sometimes, like, that was too much, but but I do that. And then I watch them like a hawk. I have the Grand Banks has a steering console seat, but it doesn't have a second seat for a passenger like a lot of boats. So I have a director's chair that I take up there and sit next to the helm. Some people call it the overseer's chair. And so, and I'm usually watching pretty close what they're doing, right? If there's anything going on, I'm watching. And yeah, we never had too much trouble. I think the crew is usually as good as I am. They're usually as attentive as I am, because they don't want to mess up. And, I've only got a couple that like to be on their cell phones all the time, and work through that.
So final question, and this one really is for both of you to answer. If you, hindsight being what it is, if you could look back and plan it again, would you change anything about the way you went about doing the loop?
Go ahead. Why don't you answer first?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe if you had time, or if there was time in the schedule, you could do a couple of little side trips. We had not planned on going to Clayton, New York at all until one of my neighbor friends said, "You've got to go there. You've got to go up the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's so beautiful up there, the Thousand Island area." And so I talked to Hube and I said, "Do we have any time where we could just go and see what she's talking about?" And that was one thing we never regretted. So, maybe there could be other opportunities for that too, if time permitted.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Always allocating more. There's never enough time. I mean, I'm sure in your loop, you missed a lot of things you didn't see. Yeah. And so I know you tried to see everything because you're trying to do it to help us out too. I would say that if I could get people to do longer legs, having Brian for that 6-week period was a godsend. So if I could get people to come for a month that I could really get along with for a month, that would be better. But I would do it again, sure, absolutely. I mean, I think it didn't detract from the trip and the accomplishment in any way. I didn't feel it was just it was a blast. Yeah,
and something you actually just said, you kind of brought up another question for me that I think a lot of people would wonder about. So I know I already said it was the final question, but I do have one more. How, from an interpersonal standpoint, I know these were mostly family members and friends, but you said something along the lines, if there was somebody I could stand to have aboard for a month. We've seen lots of, and I get lots of requests for, strangers to crew. How challenging is it to bring somebody aboard what is basically your home for that time period and have them there for a week, in your case, mostly a week, sometimes more?
Well, there was 2 things I would say that to worry about and work on. One was politics. If you have a difference, if somebody who is of a different political view, just make it off limits. So this friend that did 3 weeks with me the last time, he is of the different political persuasion. And for the whole 3 weeks, we made it clear as a bell, no politics allowed. Okay, so there was no discussion. Even when President Trump announced he was going to run again, that topic didn't come up. It was never even mentioned. Did you see? So that's one. The other thing is eating habits. Strange as it sounds, I have found the most challenging thing is eating habits, both whether, one person wants to go out to eat, one person wants to eat on the boat. One person wants to sit in the bar and eat, another person doesn't want to do that. One person wants Kentucky Fried Chicken, the other one would like a little more gourmet. It's eating habits that I think drive the biggest wedge between people. And so I've learned to just give up on that a little bit, and until I absolutely have to put my foot down. And then I also can tell people right up front that, hey, eating habits can be pretty strange. You'd be amazed. I mean, some people want their salad first and can't eat anything else until then, and some people have to eat the salad done when dinner's finished. And so it's like, oh my God, and you just don't think of these things.
Yeah.
So, those are the two big challenges. Otherwise, it was a lot of fun. What's that?
Times of meals also.
Oh, times, but all related to eating. I think eating
Yeah.
habits in general are like, oh my God, you do what? But
very interesting. Yep, we are all kind of set in our ways, aren't we? So I like, Hube, that you were able to be, kind of flexible for most of it with those different crew member. So thank you to both of you for sharing your story, because I think it is probably really encouraging for either solo loopers who really don't want to be solo, or reluctant spouses, whether that's a husband or a wife, who, maybe have a partner who has a different thought about how much of the loop they'd like to do. Like I said at the beginning, I think for many couples that creates an impasse that generally results in one kind of caving to the other's wishes in that area. Somebody perhaps who's had their heart set on the loop and never does it because they married somebody who isn't interested, or somebody who isn't interested but goes along because they want to do it for their significant other, but they kind of let you know all along that this was not their idea or their choice. So I love the way that the two of you found to make this work for both of you. And Chris, even though you didn't do the whole thing, had some great experiences on the loop, and you got to accomplish your goal of doing the whole thing. So thank you for sharing that story. It's been really enlightening.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. We appreciate all your good work. It was the information that's out there is just amazing. So thank you.
Well, I'm so glad it was helpful. That's what it's all about. I want to thank you for your service in the Navy, and congratulations to Brian on passing the bar, because I'm not sure if he knew that yet when we met. I know he had taken the test, but I don't think he had the results. So congratulations to him too. So, so thank you, Hube and Chris. Thank you for being with us.
You're
Thanks,
welcome, and enjoy the rest of your loop.
Thank you so much. And to everyone who's watched and listened today, we will be back next week with another episode of Great Loop Radio. Until then, safe cruising.